Alrighty, we're going to answer the question. Acorn squash, what is it? What do you do with it? I'm going to show you one really neat recipe for it. I'll talk to you about a couple of other things too. But first, this is an acorn squash. Now, how did it get that name? It got that name because it looks like a giant acorn, okay? Now, acorn squash is not something that you can eat uncooked. You can, but you'd have to grate it pretty much because it's kind of a hard type vegetable, all right? Now, I have some of them here that are cut up already. This recipe, Richard, you can pan down the ones that I have cut up already. So you can cut them into whatever size you want, but they're never all going to be exactly the same size. I have them cut up in sizes that what I would consider to be like a small portion to go on a plate with some other food, okay? And I'm going to show you how to cut this up. But one of the neat things about this recipe, and well, of course, so many recipes that require a very small amount of work are really some of the best ones. I think you've heard me say in the past that sometimes the simpler the item, the more difficult it is to make, you know, because there's very little masking of the final flavors and textures and so on of the item when you do so little to it to prepare it for eating, okay? In the case of the acorn squash here this morning, we are going to do only black pepper, dark brown sugar, melted butter. Put it on it, cover it with foil, and pop it in the oven and cook it until it's tender enough to eat. Again, the term tender enough to eat I use all the time because that's how you can determine the doneness level by trying it, you know, with your fork to see if it's ready to go. So, yes, of course, the recipe that it's on the PDFs, if you can access that in the DVD, will tell you approximately how long to cook it, but you're always going to do it until it's done. Now, this, of course, is the one comment that people hate to hear me say that because someone will ask me, well, how long should I cook that? And I always say, cook it until it's done. Because the trick to being a good cook, of course, is to know when it's done. That way, no matter what you're cooking, you know when to take it out of the oven or stop cooking it, whatever. So, I'm going to cut the acorn squash and show you how to do that first. This is a little bit of a tough animal, so you want to be careful. And always, again, when you're coming down like this with a knife, you never have your hand on the item itself. So take your hand away like that, see? You cut it that way, and you cut it that way. And then you take your seeds out with a spoon. Now, another good thing about acorn squash is that you can buy the acorn squash and keep it laying around in your refrigerator for a couple of weeks if you want to. Usually it'll last a long time. Unlike a zucchini squash or a yellow summer squash, you know, which are much more softer, less durable type vegetables, okay? So we're going to cut that up again a little bit like that. Now, one of the things I used to do with this particular item is I baked the entire squash. This is a different recipe I'm referring to now. I baked the whole squash until it's tender enough to eat. Then I cut the top off, scrape out the inside with a spoon, and use it as a vessel to serve the acorn squash soup in, which is kind of neat. And in those cases, sometimes I would take the acorn squash seeds and toast them like pumpkin seeds and use them for garnish on top of the acorn squash, which you can still do with this item here too. Any dish that you serve the acorn squash as, you can use the toasted acorn squash seeds on it. You make those, of course, by putting them on a cookie sheet and dehydrating them in a slow, low oven. All right, so there we have the squash itself cut up on the pan. Now I'm going to put a little bit of butter on this first because I want the pepper to stick to it all. This dish, this particular item, when you make this for people, they're going to love it. Most people have not had it like this. It's probably the simplest and easiest way to have it, and that's brown sugar and butter. Now, you can use light brown sugar if you want to, but I prefer the dark. So just pepper, and there'll be no salt put on this item because you're using sugar here, and the salt and sugar combination is not necessarily good unless it's done very carefully for the right items, and this is not one of those items. There's your pepper. Surprisingly enough, there's many dishes that you can use pepper and sugar together on, which is nice. All right, so now we're going to pack brown sugar generously on top of all this. Now, one of the things that happens during the baking process of the acorn squash that has the brown sugar, I'm going to put butter on it again, is the sugar and the butter melts and it runs all into the pan. And at the end, you'll see, when we take this out of the oven and we put all the squashes on our serving platter for the table, then I'm going to take all the stuff that melted into the pan and we're going to pour it all over it too. Okay? So now we're going to throw a little bit more butter on top of the sugar. I suppose this would be one of those recipes where you'd have to say, you can't have too much butter here, you know? Doesn't mean you should waste any butter, you know, but put just the right amount on. The fact that we put the butter on before we put the pepper on, that means the pepper doesn't get pushed around or fall off because it kind of gets stuck to the squash, which is what you want. Alrighty. Now there you have brown sugar, butter, pepper. And now we'll throw some aluminum foil on that. And we'll pop this in a 375 to 400 degree oven. And remember, you're cooking this until it's tender enough to eat. And surprisingly, this takes a fair amount of time to cook. So, but it's also can be cooked earlier in the day before you're going to serve it and easily reheated. And it holds up well for one whole, you know, I'd say for about maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 hours. It'll hold up fine at room temperature while you're waiting to reheat it. So if you're having a dinner party at night, you can make this in the morning just the way we're doing it now, and then just flash it in the oven and heat it up just before you serve it. So I have an oven here on at 375. I'm going to slip this in. We're going to time elapse this, and I'm going to bring you back to the moment where it comes out. And at that point, I'll tell you exactly how long it took to make this particular sheet pan of acorn squash. So let me get this in the oven. And I'll be back right now, as soon as this is done. All right, the completion of the acorn squash. It has been about 40 minutes, 45 minutes that we've been baking the acorn squash. I went in and tested it a couple times. I just tested it about 5 minutes ago, and it's ready to go. And we're going to pull it out now. And it's nice and tender. You can just test it with your finger a little bit like that, so you'll know what to do. Now, to serve it, throw it on your serving platter. This is such a nice fall-like vegetable. This is a great item to serve with Thanksgiving or a Halloween party dinner or any time during the fall or during Christmas or the December holidays, whichever they happen to be for you. Look at that. Now, here I have the butter and the brown sugar here mixed together. Now we'll just take some of the butter and pour it over the top. Louis, let me have some of that brown sugar that's over there. Please. Now, if you think there's a little too much butter on there, you don't want your stuff looking too greasy now. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to sprinkle a little bit more brown sugar just for fun, not much, just a little bit more along the top like that there. And it'll get soft on there right away too. Now the squash has got that underlying sweet flavor to it, And we're going to sprinkle a little chopped parsley on it that people like so much, that that nice undercurrent sweet flavor from the brown sugar. Again, this is very basic, but this is incredibly delicious. You'll really like this. And can it be reheated the following day? Yes, it can. I would reheat it in the oven, cover it up a little bit like I did with the aluminum foil. So there you have it, baked acorn squash, great for the holidays, with brown sugar, butter, and some chopped parsley. You enjoy this dish, and make sure you make this one, because you'll never know how good it is if you don't.